guys, Wyatt here, and this week we're going to be starting a new segment where we go through the Immortality Key by Brian C. Musgrove. This book is pretty controversial in the sense that it talks about psychedelics and how they affect the mind, how they're attributed to a lot of the Greek history, including their government, their rituals, and religion, how that affects us today. And without further ado, let's get started. The introduction, a new reformation. I'm an atheist. I don't believe that there is a God, she affirms. But then I began to feel this love, just overwhelming, all-encompassing love. There's a long silence, and the way I describe it is being bathed in God's love. She goes on, her voice cracking, because I find out no other way to describe it. I feel that I belong, that I was a part of everything, and that I had the right to be here. How else do I describe it? Maybe your mother's love felt like when you were a baby. This feeling of love was sufficing the entire experience. I'm talking with Diane Beiser, New Yorker, grandmother, survivor, an unrepented non-believer. She was diagnosed with mixed cell ovarian cancer in 2010 at age of 63. Ordinarily, more than half the women in Diane's position don't outlive this dreaded 5-year window past their diagnosis. But Diane was one of the lucky ones. She caught her tumor early on, stage 1C, ensuring much better odds of winning the battle. After 6 rounds of chemotherapy and 2 years of follow-up appointments, the cancer was in remission, and Diane should have been feeling optimistic. But she couldn't shake the paralyzing fear of the disease that is never cured, only contained, and could always return with a vengeance. In 2012, Diane confessed her existential crisis to one of the nurses from Perlmutter Cancer Center at New York University during a routine checkup. It was suggested she enroll in a first-of-its-kind study that their psychiatric team was conducting with Johns Hopkins University on its face. On its face, the researchers were trying to determine if psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, could ease depression and anxiety in cancer patients. According to their finding of the randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial released in the respected Journal of Psychopharmacology in November 2016, the vast majority found clinical relief, with 87% of NYU's 29 volunteers reporting increased life satisfaction or well-being 4 months afterward. Like Diane, a full 70% rated their one and only dose of psilocybin as either the most meaningful experience of their entire lives or among the top 5. The numbers were consistent with the 51 volunteers from the Hopkins study, the results of which were published simultaneously. Altogether, 80 tormented people dove into the unknown, most left with a new lease of life, forever changed. The outcome is characterized as unprecedented within the field of psychiatry. While the new batch of data was eye-catching from a therapeutic perspective, the researchers weren't necessarily looking for the next Prozac or Xanax. There's not much money in a single-dose wonder drug. The pharmaceutical industry tends to prefer long-term users who get hooked on a steady regimen of renewable prescriptions. Instead, the NYU team had joined their colleagues at Hopkins on the hunt for something far more valuable. The real question wasn't whether psychedelics might work for those confronting death, but why. And the initial answers had already led the scientists down a rather unscientific path, trespassing into corridors of the mind that once interested students of religion alone. A decade earlier, in 2006, The Hopkins team completed the first psilocybin project since the 1970s, when the research into the forbidden substance became largely impossible during the war on drugs. Under tightly controlled conditions, the psilocybin unleashed a profound mystical experience that seemed to anchor the lasting emotional and psychological benefits reported by the 36 volunteers. They had no life-threatening illnesses and were otherwise free of debilitating angst that consumed Diane. But these early results were shockingly similar to the 2016 collaboration with NYU. One-third of the participants rated their experience as the most spiritually significant of their lives, comparing it to the birth of a child or death of a parent. Two-thirds among the top 5. When friends, family, and co-workers were interviewed, they confirmed the remarkable transformation in the volunteers' mood and behavior for months, even years following a single dose. From that moment on, Dr. Roland Griffiths upended his career to focus almost exclusively on psilocybin, creating what is now called Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Unit. More than 360 volunteers and 50 peer-reviewed publications later, he's ready to call a spade a spade. In his 2016 TED Talk, Griffith said that drug-induced ecstasy he routinely witnesses in the laboratory is virtually identical to that reported by the natural-born prophets and visionaries throughout human history. The underlying experience itself, whether activated by psilocybin or some spontaneous internal flood of neurotransmitters, must be biologically normal. If we are essentially wired for mystical experiences, it raises the intriguing prospect that under the right mindset and environment, any curious soul can be instantly converted into a religious savvy. Griffith's colleague, Dr. William Richard, has been testing that hypothesis since the 1960s, when he co-developed the very scale to measure these peak states of consciousness, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. Richard himself holds the dubious distinction of administering the final dose of psilocybin in 1977 at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, the last legal refugee for this research before the extended hiatus. Together with Griffith, he was the first to get the ball rolling again in the early 2000s. Once the federal government was persuaded by the high standards of scholarly competence at Hopkins, one of the top medical schools in the country. In his 2015 book, Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences, Richard maps out the essential features of the perfect psilocybin journey. Transcending time and space, intuitively sensing the unity and sacredness of all things, accessing knowledge that is normally not available. Oftentimes there is a merging of the everyday personality with a larger, more fundamental whole. Words fail to capture the unsinkable conviction that the experiencer is somehow glimpsing into the ultimate nature of reality. An insight that seems blatantly obvious at times is usually accompanied by intense feelings of joy, tranquility, exhilaration, and awe. On the inevitable scale, Diane is certainly no exception. I'm wondering why an avid atheist would appeal to God to describe the infinite love that bathed her as the psilocybin supercharged her biochemistry. Why not the love of the universe, or the love of the cosmos, or the love of nature, I ask? Because God is as good as the universe and the cosmos and nature. These all are things we don't really know. I've always thought heaven and hell were absurd ideas. I'm not saying that mysticism at all. I tend to think of it as a bunch of baloney, and I don't think that there's any meaning to life. But it doesn't matter to me, because my own experience is all I have. I've had very religious people ask me, "You don't believe in God?" And I say, "No, I believe in love." And I can still feel it sometimes. Even now, 7 years later. Oh yes. The words don't always fail. Diane can dredge up poignant specifics about visions now indubitably tattooed on her psyche that unfolded during the psilocybin session in 2012. Lying comfortably on a couch with her eyes under a sleep shade and headphones pumping a soothing mix of classical and instrumental music, she tackled the therapeutic portion of her 6-hour journey in a pretty short order. In her mind's eye, Diane saw what she immediately recognized as her fear and anxiety. A big black lump like coal under my rib cage. On the left-hand side, which was not where the cancer was. It was not my cancer. Enraged, she yelled some colorful language at the inky intruder like a proper New Yorker. And in an instant it was gone. For good. The nasty part out of the way, Diane had nothing left to do but enjoy the playlist that had been skillfully cobbled together by the NYU team. So I drifted away. I was living in the music like a river. That's when the love of God entered Diane's life, staying with her for the remaining hours on the couch and many years since. But something else happened to me. And the research believes it holds the key to the whole experience. Sequence is tricky to verbalize. Diane is key that I not misquote her by writing something as sentimental and cliche as being at one with the universe. So she describes a process in which there is a dissolution of the self and a melting away of barriers. She remembers the moment when the concepts like internal and external no longer held true. I'm not just standing there, looking out at the world anymore. I'm a part of the world. After a lengthy pause, while she harvests the right phrase, Diane refers to this fleeting moment as a state of pure being. She recalls taking several deep breaths, exhaling with force, just to hear the air escape her chest. She needed to prove that her physical body was there, that it still existed somewhere in time and space. The source of her awareness, once so easy to locate, was suddenly everywhere and nowhere at once. And then it all made sense. That an unsettling parallel reality, waiting effortlessly to the violins. Diane arrived at the realization that birth and death don't actually have any meaning. When forced to clarify, she adds, it's more of a state of always being. Always being? Always being. So being now and always. There's no beginning or end. Every moment is an eternity of its own. A poetic breakthrough from a skeptic. That's precisely what Diane's guide, Dr. Anthony Bosis, was hoping for. As a professor with NYU's Department of Psychiatry and its director of palliative care research for the psilocybin study, the clinical psychological professional specialist is the essential spiritual and psychological distress that preys on so many Americans as they approach death. Recent statistics show that depression is up 26% for those at the end of life. In a culture that generally avoids the topic, subcontracting the gritty details over to a ballooning hospice care industry, Bosis believes we simply don't end well in this country. Instead of a bad death marked by needless suffering, he sees psilocybin as a meaning-making medicine with enormous potential. not just for the dying, but for everybody. His historic partnership with Hopkins gave both Bosis front row seat to the cutting-edge research of Roland Griffiths and William Richards that had fascinated him for years. His unforgettable session with Diane and dozens of other volunteers brought home the real-world consequences of the seeming unreal experience and mystical core of the psilocybin trials. For Bosis, Diane is the ultimate example of the sustained positive impact that can be triggered by the unexpected resonance with God's love. Even for an atheist, while language can never do justice to what Diane experienced, she undoubtedly made contact with what Bosis calls a timeless dimension that fosters non-attachment to all pain, despair, and stress of being a human, allowing a connection to something more enduring within. In a personal email, Bosis explained why such an irrational event can reliably generate so much meaning for those on the verge of death. Alright, that's where I stopped last time. That seems like doesn't it?
Let's see, how long, does it tell us how long it's recording for? I don't think it does.